As we welcome up Pastor Phil. Thanks, guys.
Jeez. Simply complicated. I might do this. Oh. Where's the parents of that kid? That's my little girl screaming. She's obviously just given me some encouragement, like, hurry up, Daddy, be shorter than last time you spoke. That's what she's saying. Be quicker. So, simply complicated. It might just be this week, but it may well be for a few weeks, this title. And before we get into it, who likes to play a little game? I like games. So we're going to play a little game called What Is It? What is it? So I'm going to show you a picture of something zoomed in, and then you have to guess what it is, and then we'll zoom back out and see if we can actually guess what it is. They're pretty easy. Pretty easy. There's like one that maybe you might struggle with. So come here, the first picture, please, Kaylee. Oh, nice, easy one. What's this? A tree. It's a tree that's been cut, so we zoom out. It's obviously, that's really blurry. That's a really bad picture. Apologies for that. But it is a tree trunk. That was nice and simple. The ring's there. Let's go a little bit more difficult. What's this? Paint. Paint, a flower. No, I might let a few more wrong answers come out first. It's not a flower. It is what my nanny used to eat every morning for breakfast, a grapefruit. That's not very zoomed in. Look at the fibers in that, so complex. Especially when you zoom in, you can see all the details of it. But on a bad picture. Next one, let's go. Oh, think a bit bigger. Think a bit bigger than a grapefruit. What do we think this is? Cheesy pizza. See, when I said go bigger, I think some of you are thinking that looks like the surface of the sun. Not that big, but it is cheese. So are these all food? I think these are all food. It is the top of a cheesy pizza. It's not that complex, really. No complex carbohydrate in cheese. I'm allowed it. So next one is, what's this? Come on then, you musicians. A microphone head. It looks like a microphone head, doesn't it? I was just tricking you there. It's not at all a microphone head. This is the eye of a dragonfly. The detail of that, the complexity of something so tiny, it's simply complicated. Next one, I can't remember how many of these I've got. What's this then? A lampshade. Yeah, it looks like, who's got a lampshade like that in their house? You should throw it away. Just saying. Anything else? I was tricking you a bit again, because again, it's a dragonfly again, but it's the wing of a dragonfly. Really complex. And we see these wings, when you're a child, sometimes you pull them off and throw them away. You don't think of anything of it. That was Joe, definitely Joe. He was that sort of kid. How many more of these have got? A couple, I think. Oh, I think it's the last one. What's this? No, it's not a dragonfly. I wouldn't do 3 on the trot like that. It's pretty close, though. It is a butterfly. So it's the wing of a butterfly. So complex, so delicate. And so playing that little game, my point is with this, is that effectively, I've been thinking about this topic for weeks and weeks and weeks. And effectively, when you zoom into anything, you quickly realize how complex it is. When you zoom into absolutely anything, when you get closer, when you put it under the microscope, when you look at a situation or a person closer, when you zoom in, you quickly realize how complex it is. And this seems like a really simple statement, but it took me a long while to get to it. It's this, that everything is complicated. Everything. Everything is complicated. Absolutely everything about every element of the universe, of life, of our bodies, of God and the concept of God, and even the Bible and relationships and civilization. Everything is complex. Every facet of our existence is simply complicated. And it really is. And the more you look into that, and many of you are interested in science, and we find out, we think we've got something discovered as the human race. We think, we've nailed this. We know how it works. And we crack it open, all this stuff pours out. And it's like the more we look, the more we zoom, the more complexity we find. Everything is simply complicated. And it's actually, I've mentioned this before, it's actually the complexities of life and the universe that actually started me on the journey into theism, of believing in God. It was actually the complexities of life. Before I grew up in an atheist home, I used to sort of argue Christians out of their faith. That was my hobby, and I'd done rugby and arguing people out of their faith. They were my two main hobbies as a teenager. That's what I'd done. And it wasn't until I learned in biology and human biology, I learned about the universe. I was thinking, this is so complex. And it was actually that was part of the journey for me believing in God, the complexity of creation. And when you think about it, this is what our brains do. Because everything is so complicated. And I love the way JP was so honest this morning. He's like, at the minute, it's too early. I haven't had my coffee. Don't talk about anything complex. But our brains are brilliant at, and I think God designed us to simplify everything. That's what our brains do. We try and simplify everything that we can do. Otherwise, the processing power required. If you think about your computer system, having to process lots and lots of things, we're getting more and more technologically advanced, and our computers are so powerful, but yet they still can't generate and flow through information like we'd want it to. In a few years, with the exponential change that's coming, I'm sure that is going to happen. But our little brains, as amazing as they are, as the most complex thing in the universe that we can tell, wants to simplify everything. Because the processing power required to actually look at the complexities of everything and take in the complexities of everything into our decision-making processes would fry our brain. It just can't keep up. And so our brain, as much as possible, likes to simplify things. It's like selective attention. It's like you guys in here, like the amount of bricks on this back wall here. Your brain doesn't go 1, 2, 3, 4, 433 bricks. Unless you're Rain Man with bricks on the floor, it doesn't do it. Your brain just goes bricks. Don't care enough. And there's a great study in a retail setting where they get a teller, I think the US call them here, or some person stuck behind a till who doesn't want to be there, serving a customer, and as the customer turns around or is distracted, they duck down and they bring somebody else up, a completely different person. And in 50% of cases, the customer doesn't even notice. Our brains like simplicity. It cuts out all of what we think is nonsense. And what it really is, it's refining just to process the information that it needs to get through, because there's so much, because everything is complex. So generally, our brains, with most things, most of the time, we like to keep it simple. And some of you in here are more complicated than others, but we generally like to keep it simple. Our brains that are working in the background like to keep things simple. And really my job, on a Sunday morning when I'm talking about a subject, is to simplify complex things. Some of the things of God and theology in the Bible, some of them are incredibly complex if you look into them in detail. And my job is to try and simplify that as best we can. Not because people aren't intelligent, but because we like simple things. Otherwise, we have to try and process absolutely everything. And so we like to keep it simple. My job is to simplify complex thoughts if I do my job well. And I would say a good teacher in school as well, a good teacher simplifies things. They don't try and complicate things, do they? So they feel smart. You know what? I'm going to teach my A-level biology kids, and I'm going to teach them in a way that's so complicated that they walk out having less information and understanding them before they went in. No, a good teacher comes and takes very complex things, and everything is complex, and tries to simplify it for us to understand principles of that situation. And so a good teacher will do that. If I do my job, hopefully I will do that. But the greatest teacher of all time, Jesus Christ, after telling his followers to love their enemy, went on to say this, to simplify our lives. And maybe you'll think this is so simple, but can I tell you this is so complex? And he simplified it for us. And we read it in the message, Luke 6:34. And we all know this. If you've been in church any length of time, it's from the Message version, so the language might be different, but it says this: here is a simple rule of thumb for behavior. A simple way that we can act out our lives every day. A simple rule of thumb. Ask yourself what you want people to do for you, then grab the initiative and do it for them. So we just talked about loving your enemies. Make sure you love your enemies, which was sort of like mind blown back then. It's like, we don't do that. We fight against enemies. We push back. We want power. We want to be in control. Jesus said, love your enemies. And he said, I want everyone. In fact, he's like, right, that's too complicated maybe for some of you. Right, simple rule of thumb. Treat other people like you want to be treated. That's it. He boiled down everything into that phrase. And Jesus clarified it further when he was quizzed on the topic, because people asked him about this. And he, just to make it real simple, even for us super intelligent humans, he boiled it down. And in Matthew, it's recorded. In Matthew 22, verse 35 to 38, I'm reading from the NLT just to this section. It says, one of them, an expert in religious law, tried to trap him with a question like they were always trying to do. They were always trying to complicate situations. And Jesus just cut through with simplicity. And he says this, "Teacher, which is the most important commandment under the law of Moses?" What's the most important thing? And Jesus replied, "You must love your Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment." And even within that sentence is quite complex. If you really dig into all of them things, there's so much complexity there. But Jesus is like, this is what I want you to do. And I love it because knowing that the religious folk would try and complicate this concept, you know, and draw it out and say, what does that mean? How can we do that? If I do this, and I'll make all these rules to make it more complicated than it needs to be, especially for the people who are under me in society. And so rather than letting them over-spiritualize that, Jesus gave a simple action point. I love this. He gave this sort of command, which is actually quite complicated in its essence, of loving your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. But he gave a practical action point of how it's practically expressed. He said, I want you to love your God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul, all your energy, depending on the translation you use, everything within you. But he says this in verse 39. A second, he said, wait. Because I'm sure they were like, yeah, we already knew that. The first one, that's all we asked for. He said, no, wait. Second is equally important. But we only asked for the first. Don't complicate things, Jesus. He's like, no, I'm giving you a simple, practical output of this very complex thing. He says a second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. And this, for me, this is the way I read this. It's like the most important commandment is to love your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, all your strength. And Jesus is like, and the way you practically show that is to love your neighbor. You love other people, and that demonstrates how you love God. And they're so entwined, maybe we can't separate them anymore. But it says this, I love it, in verse 40, talk about simplifying everything. The entire law and all the demands of the prophets are based on these two commands. So Jesus said, right, all of the Torah, all of the words of the prophet, everything that's ever been talked about God, he said, I'm going to boil this down for you. Not because you're stupid, not because you don't understand the theological aspects of everything I'm talking about and you couldn't follow along as a Pharisee and know all the religious law and be so smart. He said, but this is the way I want you to live. I want you to love your neighbor as yourself. I'm going to take everything that's in the Old Testament, everything about God, and I'm boiling it down to love God and love people. He took what is complex, and it is complex, and made it as simple as can be. And so I said at the beginning that everything is complicated. Even a grapefruit cells are complex. But everything is complicated. But Jesus made the complicated simple. He really did. He made the complex, the complicated in social life, in loving God and how we were to treat other people. He made it really simple. He took like 613 laws that were written for the Jewish folk and said, you know, we're going to keep it simple. We'll do two, which is sort of one law. It's like two that are one. We're boiling down to one law, really, that you need to follow one way of life. And so he simplifies thousands of years. Don't underestimate what he's done here. He's simplified thousands of years of teaching, of God's law, of instructions, of stories, of massive stories that have held on for generations and thousands of years and said, this is how we are to live. And it's funny because someone overheard this teaching and said, basically, how can I recomplicate this? Because he'd said this on multiple occasions in different places. And he said, this is what I want you to do. And it sort of looked different and sounded different. Sometimes it's love your enemy. Sometimes it's treat other people the way you want to be treated. Sometimes it's love your neighbor. All the same sort of thing. And someone's heard that. And it's gone around the group. The Pharisees have talked about this, what Jesus is saying. How can we trap him? How can we get out of this? And so someone overhears it, understands it, and then wants to complicate it, wants to recomplicate something that was simple. They want a loophole. And so in Luke 10:25 to 28, it says this. Just then a religion scholar stood up with a question like, listen, to test Jesus. He wasn't there to learn. He wasn't there to be led. He was coming to push back. He'd already heard on the rounds what's happening. He come to test him as an authority figure to say, hey, actually, I'm going to recomplicate what you're trying to make simple. It says this, teacher, what do I need to do to get eternal life? And he already knows effectively the answer that was coming. He's going to say, well, love you, God, love you, people, love you. And Jesus said, he's answered, what is written in God's law? How do you interpret it? I love that, the way Jesus just throws it back in his face. How do you, go on, because you've obviously, I saw you on my last talk. You're in the third row back. And I've already explained this, but go ahead. Well, how do you interpret it? And he was on his feet like, okay, right. He said that you love your God with all your passion and prayer and muscle and intelligence. They're the right-ish words, aren't they, Jesus? This is a different translation to before, but meaning the same thing. And that you love your neighbor as well as you do yourself. That's right, isn't it? Bang on. He's thinking, yeah, got the answer. And Jesus even said, good answer. He said, Jesus, do it and you will live. So Jesus like, you've got it. You've got the right answer. Jesus knows what's coming. But he says, that is it. That is the simple way I want you to live. Bang on. Simple. But sadly, it was too simple for him. It was too simple for the religious person, the scholar, the intellectual person who wants to complexify everything. He wants to complicate everything. He wanted complexity, and who knows why. Maybe just as an intellectual game, maybe, because some people are like that. But maybe he wanted to get lost in the complexity, in the labyrinth of nuance, so that they could find a dead end and hide in it. Maybe he wanted lots of shades of grey to hide in the shade, rather than the simple rule that Jesus said to live by. I believe he was trying to complicate things simply so he didn't have to love his neighbor. He was looking for a loophole. He was trying to complicate things simply just so he didn't have to do what Jesus said. And so it says in verse 29, and it even says it in Scripture, looking for a loophole, he asked, and just how would you define neighbor? He's like, let's get granular here. Let's get complex. Let's not just this sweeping generalization, because we don't like it in any other area of life. We don't do that with anyone at all. But with this whole love your neighbor, who are we specifically talking about? Are we talking about just next door or 2 doors down? Does it across the street count? Who's my neighbor, Jesus? He's looking for a loophole. He's trying to recomplicate something that Jesus, he's done thousands of years of history, of stories, of laws, of everything about God, and said, do this. And he goes, right, don't really fancy doing that. I want to recomplicate it so I can be like the Pharisees and not ever have this relationship with the Father, because I can complicate myself in religious behaviors. Who would you define your neighbor? Come on, Jesus, I want a list. Give me a list. Because I can then tick them off and I don't have to do anything to anyone else. He's recomplicating what Jesus made simple. And Jesus answers with this simple story, and it is a story. He answers him with a story, and I love it because some of us wouldn't like this. You're like, no, tell me a real life situation, not a make-believe story. But can I tell you, some stories are truer than real life. Some stories carry truth in them that a real-life situation sometimes doesn't carry. And Jesus used parables all the time to simplify, to take out all the dross and all the rubbish that we don't need to concentrate on, to say, this is the principle. This is the story. And so he told this simple story, and you've all heard it before. Even if you've never come to church before, it says this. Jesus answered by telling a story, verse 30 that is. It says this, there was once a man traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho. And we know he was a Jew. In other translations, it says this. On the way, he was attacked by robbers. They took his clothes, beat him up, and went off, leaving him half dead. So he's in a pickle. He's not just having to sit on the street, scrounging for money, or someone who's homeless or anything like that. He's been attacked. He's almost to the point of death. He's half dead. And it says this, and I love the phraseology of the message, almost sort of tongue-in-cheek, a little bit sarcastic. Luckily, a priest was on his way. Luckily, a priest was on his way, a Jewish priest who was godly and knew the law and knew everything about it, how to be close to God. They were the sort of the intermediary between normal people and God. They were better than other people. And it says this, luckily, a priest was on his way down the same road. But when he saw him, he angled across to the other side. And some of you are like, you nasty man. You've all done it. You've all done it with people you don't even like the look of in a street because you feel uneasy. Not necessarily for safety, but just like they're a bit weird, I'm going to cross the street. I know that's usually me. Other people are crossing away from me. And so we've all done it, and yet we can sort of judge this person as well and be like, oh, I wouldn't have done that. But maybe you would in central London if you saw someone beaten on the street. You might think, I don't want to get involved in that because it's a bit scary, and I'm not sure who's around. Am I safe? Am my people safe? And it says this, then a Levite, a religious man, showed up. So not quite as good as the actual priest, but of the Leviticus family, the Levite family, if you like, who were the priestly lot. A religious man showed up. He also avoided the injured man. And then it says a Samaritan, a completely different people group who were separate from these Jewish folk and had different customs and different laws and different beliefs. And there was tension there all the time. One could say an enemy, if you like, even if not at war, but an enemy, as someone who they sort of were separate and didn't come together very often. It says a Samaritan traveling the road came on him. When he saw the man's condition, I love this, his heart went out to him. His heart went out to him. And it says this, he gave him first aid, disinfecting and bandaging his wounds. See, many of us wouldn't do that right now with COVID around. So I know we don't touch you. We want to help you, but let me mask up first while you're bleeding out. It says this, disinfecting and bandaging his wounds. Then he lifted him on his donkey, lifted him on his own donkey. He put him in his own SUV boot, led him to an inn, took him to Premier Inn, kicked Lenny Henry out, and made him comfortable. And in the morning, he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper. He went and paid the bill. He went and paid everything, all the expenses that come from that. And he said to him, take good care of him. He obviously, check this out, he obviously had somewhere to go. In this story, in this parable, Jesus is saying this dude was busy. He was on his way to go and do something. And so because it come to the limit of where he could help, he went above and beyond with the cost that it would have cost him actually financially. And it said, take good care of him. If it costs any more, put it on my bill. I'll pay you on my way back. And Jesus said to him, probably with a smile on his face, I'd say, now what do you think? Which of the 3 became a neighbor to the man attacked by robbers? And the expert in the law, the religious fella, had to say, well, the one who treated him kindly. Not the nice bloke. There's a difference between nice and kind. Maybe we'll do it on another week. The one who treated him kindly, the religion scholar responded. And Jesus said simply, go and do the same. And so Jesus used this simple story to cut through all the complexities of life, to explain how we should live. And he's basically saying, keep it simple. It really is. Just keep it simple. Love your neighbor. And you might think, yeah, but Phil, you know, I've never come across a man beaten in the street, so I've never had to implement this whole love your neighbor thing. And if you think like that, then obviously you're a bit like this scholar, perhaps. You might think my situation and all the areas where I'm at work with them people who are a pain in the bum, or you haven't met my husband, or my mother-in-law. Mine's down there, she's brilliant. So you might think this with all the people in your world, all the people who you have interaction with. Because notice this story, he didn't talk about someone who was particularly even close in his world. It was someone who was actually an enemy of the people. Maybe not a personal one, but of different people groups who might not have necessarily wanted to act in this way. And you might think my situation at work or at home or with my husband or in church or with my actual neighbors is different. It's more complex. It has nuance. It has history. Things have happened. You don't know about it, Phil. It's complicated. It's simply complicated. There are reasons why I don't live by this rule of thumb. And we've all done it perhaps, you know. In this area of our life, we'll try and live by this rule of thumb that Jesus told us to live by, which is to love our neighbors and do to others as we would want them to do to us. But other pockets of our life with different people, maybe we struggle because it's simply complicated. It's too complex. It's too difficult. But when you know the history of the Jews and the Samaritans, the situation that Jesus painted in this story, it wasn't simple. That was the point of what he was making. He was saying this, and maybe it's lost on us a bit, but he was making this story to this person about this. I'm going to paint a story for you that's a simple story, but the actual plot lines, the characters in it are complicated. There's complexity in the relationship. And so he painted a complex story. It wasn't simple. It was the Samaritan situation was complicated. It's probably, like I said, lost on us. A bit more complex than perhaps we can understand fully. But like I said, the Jewish folk and the Samaritans were effectively, essentially enemies, I suppose, in the way that Jesus would define them. So there's that right off the bat. And so you come across a person in this situation, and right off the bat, emotionally, you're like, I don't like you. I don't want to live by this rule of thumb. He's not my neighbor. He lives nowhere near me. We live separate from each other. And then on top of that, so that's right from the start. And Jesus is like, don't care. Don't care that you don't want to. Don't care that you don't like them. Irrelevant. And then you add on all the other things that the guy had to do, that the Samaritan had to do, which was the personal complexities of the problem of time. This dude was going somewhere. He had somewhere to be. Who hates being late? Oh, I hate it. Anyone gets in my way when I'm late, I'm not very nice. I'm not very kind. I'm like, get out of my way. Don't like being late. I've got 4 kids now, so I'm late all the time. So I just live in this constant frustration of running places. And so, you know, when you're a busy person like that, it can be like the busyness of life is that complexity that means it can just get in the way of this simple rule of thumb of loving thy neighbor, of loving someone else, treating someone else the way you want to be treated, because it's complicated when you're busy. Like this dude was, there's a problem of time. Maybe for this dude, it could be a problem of money. See, we hear he says, here's 2 silver coins, and I'll pay you anything I get back. And our assumption is, oh, he was well off then. It's like, I don't think that's the point of the story. It was actually that he was sacrificial with the stuff that he had to give out of himself. Maybe he couldn't eat for the next week. I know this is a story, but Jesus paints this picture of like, there was cost to it. It's like, that's the complexity. If you haven't got a lot of money, and in this culture, people didn't have a lot of money. There are a few that had a lot, but most people were skint. And so to give from himself to someone he didn't even want to help, perhaps emotionally, that's the complexity that Jesus said, I want to simplify, take it off the table. Not to mention the effort of just doing it, because some of us are just like, I can't be bothered. Like, you know, loving thy neighbor, like getting people around or including people on the school run or work. It's like, I'm just too knackered, I can't be bothered. It's too complex. Or maybe for the Samaritan, like even putting himself in danger. I don't know if you're like me. I might assess a situation like that and think, someone trying to jump me. Because like a Samaritan is like, as a Jewish man, they don't like us. Maybe they're going to try and jump me. And so there's that complexity of navigating the dangers of what I should do. And we can do that in our life. I don't know what's the right thing what's the best thing to do for me as a person. Instead of seeing a situation where someone needs help, whatever that looks like in our world, and just responding in the way that we'd want to be responded to, we add complexities. And there's a bit of wisdom in that and discernment and stuff. But when it's just an obstacle, when we're just complicating it, like this dude, just to find a loophole, to say, I'm not going to do the thing Jesus told me to do because I've complicated my way out of it. I'm hiding in the nuance, in the shadows of the gray instead of the black and the white. So for me, the Samaritan had many complex reasons to walk on by, just like the priest and the Levite. I bet if you could have stopped the priest and be like, why didn't you? He'd had a list of complicated reasons why he shouldn't and didn't. And the Levite would be the same. And perhaps we're the same, that we could have a list of why we don't, to do nothing, to walk on by, to not love our neighbor, or to treat another person like we'd want to be treated. So the Samaritan situation was complex, just like your work situation, just like your husband and wife situation, just like your kids, just like everything in life. It's complicated. And the Samaritan situation was complex, but Jesus said, despite those complexities, and Jesus on purpose, I believe, painted a complex situation. He said, despite those complexities and all of the history and all of the obstacles and all of the feelings, I want you to live by this rule, this simple rule. Take all of the complications out. Love your neighbor as yourself. It's simple. And he said, now go and do the same. And so what I want to say, as much to me as I want to you, is encourage us really, is to say this. Let's don't recomplicate what Jesus made simple. For thousands of years, people fought about how we should interact and be godly. The Jews done it for a long time. They had lots of rules, and it's like we need to be like this. And Jesus come and simplified it really simply. And I want to say, let us not recomplicate what Jesus made simple. Because I think sometimes we make our decision-making process a labyrinth of complexities, just a maze of decisions that we get lost in. And by the time we find our way out, the situation has gone. And I know I've done that loads of times where a situation presents itself and a person could need help or just need a word of encouragement or money or whatever it is. And I felt like I should love my neighbor, and I've given all the reasons to complicate it and find the loophole. And then afterwards I think, why did I do that? I missed that opportunity. Probably because I recomplicated what was really simple. What Jesus made really simple, I recomplicated. So the Good Samaritan, he took what was a complex social situation, and it was the awkwardness, the perhaps political ramifications, the financial consequences, religious complexities as well, and said, I'm not going to zoom in to complicate it. Just like at the beginning with them pictures. You can zoom in so far with so much detail that you can't even tell what the big thing is on the outside. And it looked like the Samaritan done this. He didn't see a situation and zoom in to all of the granular parts of the complexities of the situation. What he did, in fact, was actually zoom out, back out to the simple principle of love thy neighbor. Because remember, if you zoom in on anything far enough, it becomes complicated. And so that guy at work who does your head in, if you zoom in far enough onto him or her, you'll find a load of complexities and ugliness and things and justification why not to love them. You could even write a book about them, probably. Perhaps you already know. Perhaps you've already made the introduction in your head. But can I tell you, they could do exactly the same with you. Anyone zooms in close enough into you, into your relationships, into you as a person, and all the complexities and all the faults will become apparent. We put anything under the microscope, it becomes complex, and we can do the same in our relationships at work, in our marriage, in every area where God's calling us to love our neighbor, and we zoom in so close that we just see all the complexities. But I think God wants us to zoom out and live by the simple principles, rather than zooming in on all the rules of the Jewish customs of here's why we don't touch or go near them people. We actually zoom back out to the greatest commandment, which is to love God, and we demonstrate that by loving people. The Samaritan zoomed out to effectively the simple act of love, of loving his neighbor. And so Jesus, I said earlier, everything is complicated, but Jesus made it simple. And I want you to think about this. Jesus wasn't saying, this is simple. He didn't say every situation is going to be simple. He's saying, everything is complicated, and yet live by this simple rule. Everything is complicated. Everything is complicated and complex, but live by this simple rule. Everything is complicated, but Jesus made it simple. And I think I'm going to open up, perhaps next week, some of the complexities of life and relationship and our personalities. But life is so complicated. Can I tell you, as someone who leads a church, people are complicated. Honestly, people are so, because we sort of think we understand ourselves, don't we? We think we've got ourselves down. I don't think we have most of the time. But I've known my wife for years. She still baffles me. She's so complex, and she must think the same. In fact, we had a conversation about it just the other day. She's like, I don't understand how we see this thing. So it wasn't a fight or anything. We see this thing so differently. We're so complicated. It's so difficult. Life is complicated and difficult. But Jesus completed the Rubik's Cube. This is what he done. He took the Rubik's Cube of life, every essence and nuance of life, and he said, right, it's really complex. Yes, it is complex. but I'm going to simplify it into a done Rubik's Cube for you. I've done all the work. Jesus done all the work. He took all of the Old Testament, all of the laws of the prophets, and boiled it down and said, just these two commands, love your God, and we demonstrate that by loving people. That's what, I've done the Rubik's Cube for you. And so, Jesus completed the Rubik's Cube, and he hands it to us and says, put that on the shelf and look at it every time you need it. That's what we do. But sometimes we're tempted to recomplicate it. And who had a Rubik's Cube as a kid? Did you ever, it comes already done. And it's very tempting just to leave it done, isn't it? Like if you're that way wired. And anyone who touches it, you're like, what are you doing? Because what you want is, you want other people who come around who don't know it's already done to think you've done it. But so as soon as someone messes it up, you're like, that's it, I might as well kill myself. It's the end of the world, end of Christmas. Throw it in the bin. But can I tell you a complete Rubik's Cube, the Rubik's Cube you see on the screen there, that is complete with all the colors on the same side. Can I tell you, it's still complex. It is still complex. It's just ordered complexity. There's still the same amount of colors and squares, but the person who framed it, the person who moved it around and ordered it in such a way for it to look visually pleasing or easy to understand, it's still complex. It's just ordered complexity. And so, and it's the same with, I believe, the universe, with life. It's so complex, but God ordered it. And Jesus simplified it for us. And Jesus says, this is your operational level of resolution. He's like, yes, it is that complicated, but this is how I want you to view it. This is all the complexities of a Rubik's Cube, but this is how I want you to view it. This is all the complexities of life and of theology and of God and the Bible and all the laws, but this is how I want you to view it. And that is to treat other people as you treat yourself. I want you to love your neighbor, even if they're your enemy. So Jesus simplified everything so we could navigate through the complexities of life, because relationships are complicated. God's complicated. The Bible is complicated. As someone who studied it for many years, the universe is complicated. A virus is complicated. One of the most simple things on the planet, and it's complex. It's so complicated. The way vaccines work are complicated. The political process to muddle our way through a pandemic is complicated. Life is complicated. It's simply complicated. But Jesus made it simple. And he said this, as I finish again in Luke 6:34. Here's a simple rule of thumb for behavior. Ask yourself what you want people to do for you, then grab the initiative and do it for them. Just treat people how you want them, how you want to be treated. And so some of you might think, and perhaps you are sat there thinking, well, can't we go a bit deeper, Phil? Isn't this like Christianity 101? Like I learned this in Sunday school. And I'm like, for me, doesn't get more deep than that. Doesn't get more complicated than that, because Jesus simplified it and said, here's a simple rule to live by. Go on then. And I'm like, when I reflect upon my life, I'm like, do I do this in every situation? Have I nailed this? Have I got the Rubik's Cube complete in every situation, in every regard, when the Holy Spirit leads me to love my neighbor as myself, to even love my enemy? Do I do that? And if the answer for you is yes, then brilliant. I want to clap you and say, well done. But if it's not, then the work's not done. It's still complicated. It's still complex. It doesn't get deeper than taking a simple truth of God and implement it in your everyday decision making. And what some of us want to do is complexify it on the way to make us feel spiritual or religious or understand God in big ways, and yet our actions don't show anything about how Jesus told us to live. And so I want to ask you, are you recomplicating what Jesus made simple? Maybe church culture's done it to you, maybe busyness, maybe time, maybe having kids. But you recomplicating what Jesus made simple. And my bottom line effectively is this: everything is complicated, but Jesus made it simple, so keep it simple. Everything is complicated, and Jesus for us made it simple, and so why don't we keep it simple? And how do we do that? Is to love our neighbor. Love our neighbor as ourselves, even love our enemy. Live by that simple rule of thumb for behavior, of asking yourself, what do you want people to do for you? And I love it. Grab the initiative, being proactive, and do it for them. And so I want to ask you a question to self-reflect. In what area have you been like the Levite? In what area of your life, with the people in your sphere of influence, have you been like that priest and not loved your neighbor the way Jesus would have commanded us? Who in your world have you recomplicated it with? And I want to say, let's stop overcomplicating it, because it is simple. It's love your neighbor. It's simple. Amen. Lord, we just thank